Okay, so when it comes to the backhand form, we see people, pros, local pros, just local people out on the course. We see them throw the backhand, and it's honestly the most popular throw. You see backhands more than anything else, more than forehands even. Obviously, definitely more than things like thumbers and all that kind of stuff. But it is still so difficult to get the form right. And that's because before we get into some of the finer details here on the surface level, the backhand is a full body movement and it kind of uses our body in different ways than maybe some people are used to, especially if you don't have athletic background in some different kinds of sports. So we're going to go ahead and break it down, and we're going to start from the ground up. We're going to start by talking about our feet. So the first thing is the X step. Everybody sees these pros and even amateurs doing this thing that we call the X step. And while the X step is great, if you're brand new to disc golf, I just want you to know it's not necessary. You don't have to do the X step. But the X step is basically a movement to help get your lower body to build a little bit more momentum and more power into your throw without having to necessarily exert a whole lot more effort. The X step basically requires you to crisscross your legs as you're walking by, kind of like the karaoke shuffle a little bit. If you ever played football or something growing up, you know what I'm talking about. But yeah, the X step is there. It's super helpful. And basically, it helps you get in a powerful throwing position to where you have your plant leg slightly out in front of you and outside of your hip. And then you have your off leg, or your trail leg, as I like to call it. And that's basically going to be where you're almost like slightly pushing off of as you brace into your brace leg. So the X step is really cool, but it's not necessary. Here are two things, though, that are necessary. The first being that plant foot. Now, one of the things that people do more than anything else when I've coached people is they have their toes pointed outward. So if you're throwing down the fairway, your toes are actually closer to the end of the tee pad than your heel is. So that's what it means when like your toe is pointing out. This is really bad to do if you're trying to get power, because that means your hips are already open. And the thing about the backhand throw is you want your hips to be closed for as long as possible, and we'll get to that in a second. So the way you can help with that is actually not just have your foot perpendicular to the tee pad or wherever you're throwing if you're in the fairway, but actually have your toes pointed inward, just a little bit, not anything crazy like a 60-degree in, because that would just be wild and would be really difficult to throw. But if you just have a little bit, have your toes pointed in just a little bit. You want your heel to technically be closer to the end of the tee pad than your toes. That's going to close those hips off. That's the first thing. The second thing is to then, as you are throwing your backhand, is you want that back foot to actually come off the ground. And there are a few reasons that you want that to happen. The first is getting that foot off the ground means that you are fully going into your brace leg. Also with that, if you keep your foot on the ground, chances are you're going to drag your toe. And think about trying to accelerate and hit the brakes at the same time in your car. That's going to be a recipe for disaster. You obviously aren't really going to get anywhere efficiently. Well, the same thing with the backhand. If you are bracing into your leg, but your back foot is dragging, you're applying the brakes while trying to accelerate in your throw. So you want to get that back foot up off the ground. Someone who does this really, really well is Kevin Jones. Now, I know Kevin throws with a little bit different style. He does a lot of, pretty much everything is a hyzer flip. He also has incredible power, but notice his back leg always comes off the ground. So if you want to work on something like that, pay attention to Kevin Jones. So that's the feet, surface level. We got into some detail there, but not talking about everything. The next thing are the hips. Now, I mentioned this already. You want them closed until the last second, and that's why having those toes pointed in is super helpful, because you're able to basically get those hips closed so that as you're engaging those hips and really coming into your brace, those hips don't open early. And so having those toes pointed in help with that. Also, you want to think about this concept of gliding. Now, I've made a video about this, but really this whole concept of gliding is just going from your back foot, your back leg, into your brace in a smooth motion. We think about other sports where people glide, whether it's basketball, volleyball, baseball, even football. You have gliding, moving, shifting your weight, however you like to think about it, but basically moving your weight and your momentum to one foot. And that's what you want to do. But this is a sort of like a passive movement. You don't want to be like forcing your body into your brace, because then that completely defeats the purpose of having a smooth throw. The next thing I want to talk about is the arms in the backhand form. And this is where a lot of people kind of find themselves in trouble a little bit. So let's start. You have two arms when you're throwing. You got the throwing arm and you got the off arm. Let's start with the throwing arm. You want to keep this loose. Now, I am not like talking like super noodle loose to where it's kind of just your muscles aren't even engage a little bit. You want to be relaxed, but you want to be able to hold an athletic position with your arm. So you got to have some focus and tension in your arm, but it needs to be loose. And I hope that makes sense. Basically, think about it like you're going to shake someone's hand. You're not squeezing your arm as if you're like getting ready to punch them or something, but when you're going to shake, you have control and movement in your arm, but it's nice and loose. The other thing, do not pull your arm. If you ever hear me say like, oh, you're pulling the disc, or you're strong arming the disc, whatever it is, that means that your arm is doing the throwing motion. And this might be breaking some brains for people, especially if they're brand new to disc golf, but you actually don't throw with your arm, if that makes sense. There's a lot of other components to the disc golf backhand that is more than just your arm, and we've already talked about some of them. And so you actually don't like pull the disc actively with your arm. It looks like you are pulling the disc with your arm, but you're not actually physically, muscularly doing that. And now the other thing about this throwing arm is you want to extend. Now, you might hear some people say reaching back or reach, and I've even said reach. I've said reaching back before. I've also said reaching out before, reaching back, reaching out. But I've started using the term extend because I think it's a little bit more passive. You might also hear some people talk about coiling and uncoiling. It's this same idea that your arm is extending out, but you're not putting this force behind it. What you actually want to be doing in the disc golf backhand is stepping away from the disc. So your arm is extending out, but you're not pushing it. You're walking away from it, which is a really cool concept. And as you work on this kind of thing, you start to notice the difference. It's a lot more passive, and your arm gets into position. The other thing to keep in mind with that is that by extending it, you want the disc to still be in front of you, like in the sense of it's not directly behind you when you throw. You actually want it, 6 to 12 inches out in front of you so that it can stay on the line that you're going to throw it on. Because if it's directly behind you, that's going to be really hard to hit your line because you have to go through your body first, which would not work. Okay, so now the off arm. This is something that not a ton of people focus on. I think it's really important, and it can make or break what you're doing with your throwing arm. So the first thing is, when we talk about engaging hips in the backhand throw, you want to have that gliding movement. We're talking about that back foot coming off the ground. That's going to help you engage those hips more because there's nothing for your body to fall back on when that back foot is off the ground. With that, you want that off arm, and for me, that's my left hand, my left arm. You want that coming into your side, like getting that elbow coming down into your side, because that's going to help you initiate that back rotation that we're going to get to, and then also keeping with your hips. Think about a baseball swing. When you're swinging a baseball bat, your hips and your back arm on the bat are coming in and across your body at the same time. That's what we want to have here too. And what's going to happen is that movement is going to actually power the disc as it comes across your body. So that's why it looks like you're pulling with your throwing arm, but what's actually happening as your hips and your off arm come around like a pulley system, your front shoulder, your throwing arm starts to pull the disc through naturally, because that's how our bodies work. So it's a really cool concept, and it just takes practice. But think about a pulley, and you only pull one side, but both sides move. So you want to be having that left arm if you're throwing with your right hand, or your right arm if you're throwing with your left hand, to be kind of initiating that motion with your arm. And now I mentioned the back. Throwing with your back is part of the throw, but it's less about this idea of throwing with your back, which doesn't always make sense, and more about using your back to engage your shoulder hinge. So like as you're having that pulley come, you're going to be having your arm come across. Now don't think about throwing with like your deltoids. Don't think about throwing obviously with your elbow and your wrist. That's going to come naturally and kind of create this whip effect. Think about using your lats and basically your traps a little bit. Like you'll feel it there when you throw this way a lot, between your lats and your traps. You're going to basically have that your back is kind of using your shoulder as a hinge to get the disc out of your hand. And so you're going to have kind of this like whip effect, or this whip sound, similar to what we hear with someone like Drew Gibson. And so that's kind of how you start to get that thing. The other thing is your back needs to have an athletic position. If you are perfectly pinned straight, that's not an athletic position. There are very few sports where you want to be perfectly straight. The only time you want to have this kind of posture where your back is completely straight is if you're a runner. Whether you're a tracker, for someone who ran track and field and cross country, I sure know how to mess up those words. So if you run cross country, if you run long distance, or you're a sprinter, whatever it is, your running form is a straight back. You want to have that. But in disc golf, you don't want a straight back on every throw. In fact, a straight back is normally going to cause you to throw with Anheuser. So what you actually want to do is assume an athletic position. So think about basketball players, volleyball players, softball, baseball. They have a rounded back. Football players, especially, even when they're sprinting, if you notice, you can tell who has like a track and field background in football and who doesn't. Because when some players get into an open space and they're running towards the end zone, you'll see them straighten their back out a lot more, whereas others will stay kind of hunched over, because that's a football running position. It's that athletic position to make quick movements. And the disc golf backhand is all about making quick movements. And so it's super helpful to have this athletic position, this sort of rounded back, not bent over, but just rounded, because it helps your body stay nice and loose and athletic. But with that being said, you want a neutral spine. What I mean by this is that as you're engaging your hips, as you're bringing your off arm down into your side, and then eventually the disc is coming across your body, you don't want to be spinning and rotating and twisting your spine to throw. You're really not using your spine at all in this. You're going to keep it nice and straight, because that means you're well balanced. And as the disc comes across your body, you're going to see it pass your eyes. And then eventually your follow through will cause you to turn and rotate and face where you threw the disc. So we want to have that nice neutral spine. That's how you remain in an athletic position. Now, speaking of watching the disc where it flies, let's talk about your head. You want to keep your eyes on the target until the very last second. You do not want to be turning away too soon, because chances are you're not going to hit your line, you're not going to hit your target. You want to be looking until the last second, making sure you're all lined up. The other thing is that as you're looking at your target, eventually you have to look away at the very last second. But don't turn your head and look backwards, because then you completely lose your sense of direction. You want to keep your eyes perpendicular. And so this is where I talk about trusting your peripherals. So you're going to have, for me, throwing right hand backhand, my right eye's peripheral is going to almost be keeping an eye on the target, and my left eye peripheral is going to be noticing that the disc is extended out from me as I'm stepping away from it. I'm trusting my peripherals, but I'm looking perpendicular to both the disc and the target. I'm not focused on either one of them for a split second. And that's going to keep that spine in that neutral position. That's going to help me stay in an athletic position. And basically, by not watching the disc, you're making sure that you don't end up rounding, which is a huge problem for disc golfers of pretty much all skill levels up to about, I would say, most advanced players aren't struggling with rounding, and definitely pros aren't struggling with rounding. There's actually some arguments out there. I've heard Paul Ulibarri talk about this, that you need to round in order to throw the anhyzer, which is a very interesting concept, but that's definitely another topic for another video. And then now the next, with the head, it's like, okay, so it's coming across. I need to be watching as it comes out of my hand. Not necessarily. When you're throwing, your eyes, let the disc pass in front of you. Allow your follow through your back shoulder. Allow that to kind of move your head, almost as if it's like going to hit you in the chin. Not obviously that close, but you get the idea, the fact that as that shoulder comes in, you're naturally going to start looking at where you threw. You don't want to look early, because looking early can cause you to pull on the disc, which is not what we want to do. It can also cause you to open your hips up early. And so we want to keep that spine neutral, and we want to allow the disc to pass in front of our eyes. So that's basically a high overview, and even that high overview had a lot of detail in that. And so I hope that helped and kind of gave you a really good understanding of what exactly happens in the disc golf backhand. As you can tell, there's a lot that goes into it, but with practice, with patience, and just continuing to do the little things right, you will have good success throwing the backhand. And I think you're going to get really good results from following these tips.